InvestoraDeals.com Podcasts.
Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of InvestoraIdeas.com Podcast, looking at cannabis news, stocks to watch, as well as insights from thought leaders and experts. In today's podcast, we look at a few early announcements from Harvest Health and Recreation Incorporated, trading on the CSE as HARV and the OTCQX as HRVSF. FSD Pharma Incorporated, trading on the CSE as Huge and the OTCQB as FSDDF. MRMD Incorporated, trading on the OTCQX as MRMD, as well as Lift & Co. Corporation, trading on the TSXV Venture as Lift and the OTCQB as LFCOF. But first, before we get into that, for starters, welcome into 2020. Obviously, cannabis had a pretty rough year in the 2019 year with a lack of really any sort of revenue from a lot of the Canadian producers. But as we move into Cannabis 2.0, that's hopefully expected to change. And as we've seen in the last couple of months, and I'm sure we will see in the next couple of months, a lot of the Canadian companies as well as US companies have begun to restructure their strategies, focus primarily now on quick sources of revenue, generating cash flow and removing debt, as that seems to be the issue with the majority of the companies out there on the market right now. So before we start with early announcements as well today, even though most cannabis products have already started their Cannabis 2.0 sales in most provinces in Canada, the latest generation of cannabis products will now also be available for legal sale in Ontario starting today, as the Ontario Cannabis Store releases 59 new products including edibles, beverages, lotions, and concentrates. And like dried flower in the year previous, the OCS also warns that supplies are limited and expected to run out fast. So now basically every province has their Cannabis 2.0 products that will be coming out within the next coming weeks. As far as what we're expecting with sales, there's still a limited amount of SKUs that will be available for actually on-store shelves in the next coming months. So I would say that probably not until April or May will you start to actually see more data-driven results about the sales and actually have more accurate information. As for right now, pretty much anything that arrives on stores' shelves is most likely going to sell out immediately, which doesn't really give a vast representation of the quality of those products or what the actual consumer demand is. So, as I said, until we actually get the majority of those products out there in May and probably into the summer, you're not going to really have an accurate portrayal of what the actual expectation is of those sales of edibles. But so far, at least for the small amount of dispensaries that do already offer these, they have been selling out almost immediately, again, regardless of the type of products they're offering. So it does show that as long as these products can get to the shelves, they will most likely have pretty high sales for the next little while. So first, looking at Harvest Health and Recreation, a vertically integrated cannabis company with one of the largest and deepest footprints into the U.S., who announced that negotiations to acquire Interurban Capital Group Incorporated, the owner and operator of Have a Heart CC, have reached a stage that now requires disclosure. So preliminary terms contemplate an acquisition price of approximately $87.5 million in Harvest stock and assumption of debt convertible into 205,000 multiple voting shares of Harvest stock, subject to applicable Canadian securities laws. And Have a Heart assets include 11 operational dispensaries in California, Washington, and Iowa, and licenses for 7 retail locations in California. So Harvest looking to expand their U.S. footprint. Again, as I mentioned, most of these companies are looking to remove as much debt as possible and acquire as much quick revenue generating operations as quickly as possible. So acquiring these dispensaries in states that have already established themselves, Washington, California, is going to be an easy asset for any company. As well, moving forward, the sort of cross-pollination of U.S. and Canadian companies is becoming more and more common, as again a lot of the U.S. companies find partners to enter into the Canadian edibles and recreational market and vice versa. And it does seem to be that there's less and less sort of separation between the U.S. and Canadian companies moving forward, as again both seem to be trying to work together to basically stay afloat at this moment. And also a lot of the U.S. companies are taking advantage of sort of the weak position of some of the Canadian companies, which was obviously the opposite a couple years ago, but it is what it is now. So next, looking at FSD Pharma, who announced that its Class B subordinate voting shares have been approved for listing on the NASDAQ capital market under the symbol HUGE. Trading on the NASDAQ is expected to commence on the market open on Thursday, January 9th. The company shares will continue to be listed on the Canadian Securities Exchange under the ticker symbol HUGE. As we announce this much anticipated and coveted milestone, I want to congratulate the FSD Pharma team, our stakeholders, and most importantly, our shareholders. I also want to extend my gratitude to the members of the board of directors of FSD Pharma, and especially to the founders of the company, for their vision and for giving me an opportunity to lead the FSD Pharma team to achieve the strategic advantage. It's exciting to realize that once we begin trading on NASDAQ, we'll be included in a select group of 12 Canadian domiciled cannabis companies trading on either the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, and the first company in the history of the Canadian Securities Exchange to be dual listed on a major U.S. exchange, stated Raza Bakari, MD, Executive Co-Chairman and CEO. So FSD Pharma, who I've talked about a bunch in the past, now being able to uplist on the NASDAQ, which does put them in a quite small elite group of cannabis companies right now. We'll see how that does sort of expands them moving forward. But they're a company that stayed pretty consistent since the beginning of really the industry startup in the last couple of years, and has had a really nice steady progress of uplisting and sort of expansion. So hopefully this falls in line with that. Next, looking at MRMD Incorporated, a leading multi-state cannabis and hemp operator who announced that its Illinois dispensaries in Anna and Harrisburg saw a significant uptick in sales on the first day under new laws to legalize recreational use of cannabis throughout the state. So in May of 2019, the Illinois General Assembly passed the HB 1438 law legalizing recreational cannabis use and sale in the state for adults, which became effective on January 1st of this year. Illinois is the 11th state in the nation to allow for the sale of recreational marijuana, and 33 states allow for the sale of marijuana for medical use, which Illinois legalized in 2013. And industry analysts estimate that the new legal market for recreational or adult use cannabis could exceed $2 billion annually. And this new market, in addition to a surging medical market, which according to Illinois government sources nearly doubled in size and number of patients during 2019, exceeding 200 million and nearly 90,000 respectively. Also, another piece of good news coming out of Illinois that's unrelated to the announcement, but related to the legalization of their cannabis. On December 31st, the eve of the adult use cannabis legalization in Illinois, Governor J.B. Pritzker announced that he was pardoning more than 11,000 low-level cannabis-related convictions ahead of adult use sales, and the pardon cleared 11,017 convictions involved with less than 30 grams of cannabis. So according to Marijuana Business Daily, the maximum number of adult use dispensaries allowed in Illinois by 2020 is 185, or 1.5 retail stores per 100,000 residents. And by comparison, Oregon currently has 15.7 recreational marijuana retailers per 100,000 residents. MRMD plans to open 2 additional Illinois dispensaries in the coming year. And MRMD's dispensaries in Harrisburg, which operate under the Thrive brand, saw customers waiting outside for hours before opening. MRMD worked hard prior to January 1st to prepare for expected demand by recreational users while ensuring valued medical customers were still receiving the attention, service, and access to products that they have come to expect. And it was positive to see the demand appearing to be high in rural areas as the more concentrated and competitive urban areas of the state. MRMD CEO Bob Fireman noted that, "We're excited to see the response by the people of Illinois to the new law. Georgie and his team, led by Rosie Narminsky, worked diligently servicing our medical patients while preparing for the recreational launch in our 2 dispensaries. They're in the process of developing 2 additional adult use dispensaries in Illinois allowed under our licenses. They've been valuable advocates for the Illinois cannabis program from their inception, providing guidance to both state and local authorities. We're proud to have seen them part of the MRMD team, and with our consolidation on track, MRMD's revenue for these licensed businesses will now be included in our financial results in 2020, which in turn will generate greater longer-term value for our shareholders." So MRMD, probably not the only one who's benefiting from the Illinois recreational laws right now, but again, because there are going to be limited licenses and not a massive amount of dispensaries in that state, the companies that are already in that state and have already set up their dispensaries and have the limited licenses available will most likely benefit from, again, some increased high demand. We've seen this in every state or market so far, where you switch over from medical to recreational. The demand for recreational booms pretty significantly. It is nice to note, though, that they are actually trying to still make sure that their medical patients are being served, as we've seen, again, through other markets and other states, that can be a failure of transition from medical to recreational, is that the medical market often gets left behind, which, again, has happened in most of the developed states, but now we are starting to see a turnaround. And lastly, looking at Lift & Co. Corporation, who returns to Vancouver this week with the annual Lift & Co. Cannabis Business Conference on Thursday, January 9th at the Vancouver Convention Center. Canadian international industry and business leaders will be taking the stage for a day of dedicated talks on the topics affecting cannabis going into 2020. Then the Lifting Cannabis Expo then takes over the VCC for a massive 2-day trade show on Friday, January 10th and Saturday, January 11th. So tapping into this trend, this year's 2020 LCBC keynote will be Data, the New Soil for Cannabis Growth, for which Lift & Co. will be joined on the stage by two of North America's leading data and consulting firms, Nielsen and EY Canada. And this trio of presentations, moderated by Ipsos, will address the future of data insights and how analytics will propel cannabis into the next major CPG category. We're so excited to welcome CPG Insight heavyweights like Nielsen, Ipsos, and EY Canada to elevate the cannabis conversation this year, said Matei Alaro, CEO of Lift & Co. Their presence signals an important shift for cannabis in year 2 and will set the tone for a 3-day event that will offer attendees the earliest views into cannabis into 2020. Lift & Co. has always strived to drive important topics forward for our events, and we're looking forward to see what's shaping up to be our most important Vancouver conference to date. And these data sessions come on the heels of the launch of Lift & Co.'s consumer insights platform, Cohesion, in 2019, and recently announced strategic partnership with Nielsen to create an industry-first consumer segmentation tool for early 2020. The Lift & Co. Cannabis Expo Vancouver 2020 takes on January 10th and 11th, and again the actual speech this Thursday. And the expo features over 280 exhibitors and 2 full days of talks on the Fire and Flower stage. Together, LCBC and Expo are Canada's largest cannabis consumer and industry convention, and last year's Vancouver event drawing in more than 18,000 visitors. Investor Ideas will be attending Lift & Co. this year to cover some of the events going on there, and hopefully there will be some good insight into what's going to be expected of the 2020, especially when it comes to data insights, as well as really what's expected at a realistic level for Cannabis 2.0 sales and how some of these LPs can start generating revenue and recovering some of their debt. That's all for today's podcast. Enjoy the rest of your Monday. That's all for today's podcast. Podcast is now a certified word trademark on the blockchain through Cognate Incorporated CM certification. InvestorIdeas.com podcasts are also available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play Music, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and TuneIn. If you'd like to be a guest or sponsor of this podcast, please contact InvestorIdeas.com. Investor Ideas reminds all listeners to read our disclaimers and disclosures on the InvestorIdeas.com website, and this podcast is not an endorsement to buy products or services or securities. Investors are reminded that all investments involve risk and possible loss of investment. Investor Ideas does not condone the use of cannabis except where permissible by law. Our site does not possess, distribute, or sell cannabis products.